Thank you, Presiding Officer. This budget benefits from an additional £5.2 billion from the UK Labour Government. In July, the people of Scotland turned the page so that Labour could end austerity and take the tough decisions to deliver urgently needed investment in our public services. And this means that today we had the opportunity to take a new direction in Scotland. And not just a question of how we spend £5 billion, but how we spend an unprecedented £60 billion budget. It's an opportunity to deal with the country's challenges, to deliver better outcomes rather than trumpeting a shopping list of inputs. If only they had the imagination to take that new direction. Instead, in recent days, we have been invited by the SNP to stretch our imaginations, to suspend disbelief and accept that this is John Swinney's first budget. The First Minister is supposedly now the fresh-faced ingenue of Scottish politics, a break from the past that he would like the country to forget. In reality, John Swinney has personally delivered 11 SNP budgets from that very spot. And for all of that time, they have hidden behind grievance and blaming a dreadful Tory government. But today must be, Presiding Officer, finally the day when the excuses end. Because today's budget lands in the midst of a rapidly escalating crisis in our NHS. From Aberdeen to Glasgow and everywhere in between. The frost has barely bitten, but the predictable, indeed predicted, crisis is unfolding. The Auditor-General has set out in the starkest terms possible that it is the failure of this government. He is repeating his warnings of 12 months ago with added feeling, and that feeling is that he is banging his head against a brick wall. It is abundantly clear that nothing of any effect has been done. No reform, no vision, no plan. Scotland is going in the wrong direction under the SNP. 1 in 6 Scots on an NHS waiting list. Schools falling further behind. A national housing emergency. Growth lagging behind the rest of the UK. Every Scottish institution weaker. So does the Cabinet Secretary agree? It's not enough just to try and correct the mistakes made last year by putting back the money that was slashed in the budget or in the cuts chaos of the now annual SNP emergency budget in the middle of the year. And can she finally accept that her statement amounts to quite literally more of the same, sending Scotland ever faster in the wrong direction?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think I must have missed the welcome for the record funding for the NHS, the record funding for local government and the funding for affordable housing. And of course, Michael Marra started with talking about the funding from the UK government, and there is indeed an uplift of funding. That's very welcome, but it's very theoretical unless that money gets to the frontline services. And the only way it gets to frontline services is if people vote for this
Cabinet
budget.
Cabinet Secretary, there's huge interest in questions this afternoon. Now, if I have to keep interrupting so we can hear one another, members will have to understand there will be a consequence. We will be able to take fewer members. Cabinet Secretary.
And Michael Marra mentioned something along the lines of the frost biting. Well, let me ask Michael Marra this. Surely Labour are not going to vote against winter fuel payments for our pensioners for a third time in a row. Surely not, because that really would lack a lot of credibility. A lot of credibility. And surely Labour are not going to vote against the measures we are taking to mitigate the two-child cap. So I hope in all of the froth from Michael Marra that Michael Marra and his colleagues will recognise that this is a budget that puts money into our frontline services and lifts kids out of poverty and gives our pensioners the winter fuel support they need. I can't imagine a scenario where Scottish Labour is going to vote against that.
Paul Rossgreer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. £4.9 billion for climate and nature sounds positive. I'll read with interest what it contains. It cannot be padded out with greenwashing. I'm glad to see free bus travel for asylum seekers and free ferry travel for young islanders included. These were both commitments secured by the Greens when we were in government, but cut by the SNP this year, so I'm glad those cuts have been undone. I'm also glad the government's agreed to the Green proposal to increase tax on the purchase of second and holiday homes, but Despite the Cabinet Secretary's claims, this budget contains a huge cut to core council services like schools and social care. It fails to expand free school meals to primary 6 and 7. It cuts the Nature Restoration Fund and the cycling, walking and safe routes funding, and efforts to make homes warmer and greener fall short by £250 million. I will not dismiss the positive steps taken, but does the Scottish Government accept that if they want green support, significant further changes will be required? This budget will need to do much more for people and planet.
Cabinet Secretary.
I don't accept that, and I would ask Ross Greer to look very carefully. So, for example, at table 4.12, around the local government settlement, because the budget compares to the ABR position, something that this Parliament wanted through the committee process, through FPAC, it means, of course, that there needs to then be a recognition of the in-year transfers that happen, particularly from health and education. All of that is set out at table 4.12 that shows the £1 billion of extra investment in local government. So I would urge Ross Greer to look at that. But let me welcome the welcome that he has made for the very substantial investment, the £4.9 billion investment in positive climate action. I'm sure that is something that Green colleagues will welcome, and I'm happy to continue to discuss with him and others the content of this budget.